Nosso próximo convidado é professor da Stern School of Business da New York University e pesquisador de economia e gestão na globalização. Para falar como a expansão global afeta o desempenho dos negócios e quais as estratégias das empresas que disputam os mercados internacionais, eu chamo ao palco o professor Robert Salomon.
Good morning, São Paulo. Bom dia. Before I begin, let me just thank Banco Santander, Grupo Globo, Valor Económico, and American Airlines for affording me this opportunity to speak today about my recent book about globalization. Now, I realize that the world is changing. We're living in a world now with increasing anti-globalization sentiment, with populism on the rise, nationalism on the rise, and policy that's turning more protectionist. Now, I would understand if you looked at the title of my book called Global Vision, and you thought that I could address these things, that I had ideas to eliminate world hunger, to eradicate poverty, and to create world peace. Unfortunately, my book is a more modest one. I will leave those items to President Obama. My specialty is companies and how companies globalize. And the interesting thing is, I've now spent the last 15, almost 20 years speaking with managers about globalization. And when you talk to them, you hear the same themes. They tell you the world is rapidly globalizing. Even more than that, they will tell you that the world is already fully global. And companies look to this and they say, well, if we're globalizing, then borders are irrelevant. And if borders are irrelevant, then in order to succeed, I must grow to become a global company. Otherwise, I cannot survive. And if you look to the data seem to bear that out. These are the corporate investments in global markets over the last 20 years or so, up until about 2013. And what we've observed is that companies are investing in global markets at a rate of about 7% per annum. 7% per annum in growth in global corporate investment. Think about that for a minute, because over that same time period, the global economy has grown about 3 to 3.5%. So we're talking almost double the rate of global growth, and more than double the rate of global inflation over that same time period. That seems to be a vote of increasing confidence in the future of globalization, or at least a misperception of how globalized the world is. Now, I have a colleague at NYU, his name is Pankaj Ghemawat, and he generates these statistics on what we perceive to be the levels of globalization versus the actual levels of globalization. And the reality is, believe it or not, that the world is much less global than most of us believe. When Pankaj asks people, for example, what percentage of phone calls do you think cross borders on any given day? You get wild estimates all over the map, 15%, 20%. The reality is, it's about 2%. And again, when we're thinking about globalization, globalization is the free movement of goods and services, of capital, of information, ideas, and people. And so the statistics that I'll present that are produced by my colleague will reflect some of those globalization flows. When you ask people, what do we think about the role of immigrants? What proportion of the population do immigrants represent? You can think about a number in your head. The actual number is 3%. About 3% of the world's population is comprised of first-generation immigrants. That's people and information. And you might say to me, well, come on, this is not information. Who uses the telephone? Nobody uses the telephone anymore. We WhatsApp each other, we text each other, we send each other emails. Okay, so if we think about data, the amount of data that crosses borders on any given day is only about 5 to 6%. Let's talk about investment. If we think about something like corporate investment, which is some of the data that I presented to you before, of all the global corporate investment that took place in the world, or that takes place in the world in any given year, the total of it, the total amount that crosses borders, is only about 10%, a little bit less, in fact. Talking about the movement of capital. Now, if we think then about the movement of goods and services, which is often what we think of when we're talking about globalization and the ties that bind nations inextricably. Yes, we do have a fair amount of trade that occurs in the world, but when you ask people, what percentage of the world's GDP is comprised of trade? And they come up with numbers 40%, 50%, 60%. The true number is actually around 20%. Once you take into account all the double counting of one country's exports as another country's imports, and then goods are fabricated in one country, exported to another, and then re-exported to a third, it's only about 20%. And then finally, for me, who's a scholar of organizations and companies, this is one of the most surprising statistics that I find, at least amongst those managers that I talk to. Of all the companies in the world, the percentage of companies that have any global operations is less than 1%. Now, of course, most of you in this audience probably work for organizations that do have a global footprint and do operate globally. You are in the tail of the distribution. The world looks a little bit different than most of us in the room. The reality is, though, when you dig into those companies that do expand abroad, that do have a desire to go, that do want to be in global markets, what you find is that companies often struggle. How do they struggle? Well, I have some studies, in fact, that show that foreign companies have higher startup costs, and it takes them longer to start up their organizations than similar domestic companies. On average, it takes them 3 months longer, and cost them 10% more to start up their organizations. We know that foreign companies pay higher wages and have a higher cost structure than similar domestic firms. We know that foreign companies tend to get sued more on average than domestic firms. And when they get sued, they're more likely to lose. I have a study in the United States banking sector, for example, that shows that foreign banks operating in the United States are more likely to receive regulatory violations than domestic US banks. And we know that foreign firms have a higher probability of failure relative to similar domestic companies. Now, the interesting thing is, it's not all bad news. I mean, there are multinational companies, there are very influential multinational companies, and there are very successful multinational companies. Those 1% of firms, or less than 1% of companies that operate globally, many do so successfully. But even for them, they struggle. They tend to have lower operating margins on average. They tend to have lower levels of profitability on average. And they tend to have lower levels of productivity on average than they do at home, and then similar domestic competitors. These are some data from another colleague of mine, Juan Alcacer at Harvard University. He shows in the blue line you have domestic sales, the operating margins of companies in the domestic market, versus the operating margins of companies that operate globally. And what he finds is that over time, again, this is about a 20-year period over the same time I showed you that global investment, that operating margins in foreign countries tend to be about 2 to 3% less than they are in a company's own home country. I can provide many examples. Think about this one, Uber. What do we know about Uber? Uber exited China. Uber was kicked out of markets in Spain and Germany and France. Uber is losing money in India. When I think about Uber in China, they lost $2 billion. And that's not $2 billion of write-downs in equity value. That's $2 billion in cash. Uber, it's not even sure that Uber will be able to continue to operate in London. I think about Walmart. Walmart is another US company that has struggled here in Brazil, having a very hard time turning profits here. Walmart is a company that entered China in 1996. It took a full 12 years until 2008 for them to turn even the smallest of profits. And they will readily admit that they are unlikely to earn a return on their initial investment in China. I think about companies like Starbucks, which is a very successful multinational company. You look at Starbucks' second largest market of Japan. In Japan, Starbucks earns 50% of the profitability that it earns in the United States. And so for the last, again, 15, 20 years or so, I've studied this one question. Why do companies continue to struggle in global markets? And the answer that I found is because of institutional differences. Countries are different. How are they different? They're different in culture. They're different in politics. They're different in economics. And as a scholar of institutions, you can think about all these institutions of countries and say these are the things that create impediments or difficulties for companies that are expanding abroad. We, in the scholarly academic literature, tend to refer to these things as a liability of foreignness. You don't speak the language, you don't know the rules, you don't know the laws, you don't know what the proper way to behave, you don't understand the economic environment or the consumer as well. This creates cost, and this creates difficulty. So again, this liability of foreignness, what we'll define as the cost associated with being a foreigner in a foreign land. This applies not only to companies, but this applies to individuals as well. For those of you who are not natives to Brazil, it's a struggle to adapt. You don't speak the language, you don't know the rules, you don't have the social connections and the friends that you can call on from 20, 30 years ago and say, hey, I'm in a jam, can you help me out? You are at a disadvantage, and this disadvantage translates into real costs and generates real risks. And so another thing that I've been working on is not just why do companies struggle, but what can we or they do about it? If we know that at the root of these disadvantages that foreigners face are these institutional differences between countries, the question is can we measure them? Can we find some measures of culture, of politics, of economics for one country, and compare that to measures of culture, politics, and economics from another country? Because if we can measure it, we can price it. And so about 10 years ago, what I did was I created this algorithm, because right now, let's face it, we live in a digital world. Every day, there's more and more and better and more robust data available to us. And there are now fantastic sources of economic, political, and even cultural data. And so about 10 years ago, what I did was I started collecting these data, sometimes on a daily basis, scraping these data from wherever it can be found. You take the institutional measures from one country. You take the institutional measures from another country. You compare them. And what this algorithm does then is it calculates specific cultural factors that generate risk, specific economic factors that generate risk, specific political factors that generate risk. You can think of this as a recipe. You take ingredients from culture, you take ingredients from politics, you take ingredients from economics, you mix them in a bowl, you spin them together, and out pops out a spread, a risk spread. And this risk spread now is expressed in basis points, in terms that can be interpreted and applied by managers. To give you an example, let's look at the United States. And if we look at the risk of the United States relative to a country like China, the algorithm generates a risk spread of 15%. China is very different than the United States. If we think about a country like Canada, you would probably assume that Canada is reasonably similar to the United States, except for that part of Canada that more resembles France than it does the United Kingdom. But this presents a risk to the United States of about, or US companies, of about 4%. Right? The risk is much tighter. When I think about a country like Brazil, the risk spread between the United States and Brazil several years ago was down to about 13%. After your most recent recession, that rose to about 17%. And I looked at it just yesterday, it was hovering now around 15.5%. These change by the day, they change over time, you can observe them. So then the next question is, if you have these risk metrics, what can you do with them? Well, the most obvious use is that you can think of this in some ways as a country risk measure, or what you guys might refer to as risco país, right? Now, the interesting thing about how this differs from a traditional risco país measure is that risco país tends to just capture absolute risk. What's the absolute risk that exists in Brazil, or in Canada, or in China? The global acumen approach looks at risks relatively. What's the risk to a company from the United States? Or how risky does Brazil look relative to the United States? And that might change every day depending on the differences between US and Brazilian institutions. And it also might be different from the risk between a country like Spain and Brazil. So the first difference between this approach is that it takes into account relative risk. And we're at the point now where we have 3,200 combinations and permutations of country-to-country risk ratings on any particular day. What's the second use of this particular model or this algorithm? The second is for corporate finance or investments. You can think about, for all of the finance people in the room, you can think about this as a risk adjustment to some kind of domestic cost of capital, where you have your standard domestic cost of capital that you might use, and on top of that you take into account the extra added risk that you'll be taking on for operating in a country that's particularly different from your own. And then finally, you can think about applications here in the field of insurance, where often insurers will underwrite policies for political risk or commercial risks of operating in various countries throughout the globe. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of a flavor of the kinds of work that I've been doing on global risk. Globalization is not as easy as many think. The world is actually a lot less globalized than most people think. There is this liability of foreignness. You are at a disadvantage because you don't know the language, you don't know the religion, you don't know the laws, you don't know the rules, you don't understand the economic environment. Now, the interesting thing is that in this increasing debate and this anti-globalization sentiment that's risen over the last few years, what's amazing to me is how people tend to think that globalization, as they perceive globalization, as being far more ubiquitous than it actually is. I'm happy to have debates about the merits of globalization, and I do believe they are many. There have been 400 million people who, over the last 30 or 40 years, have risen out of abject poverty. Much of that has to do with Asian economies becoming part of a broader global economic environment. That is a good thing. How can companies think about globalization? How can companies think about the risk? And how can they overcome the constraints? I think the most important thing is understand institutions. Be sensitive to the cultural, political, and economic environments in which you'll be operating. But now, we can do more. It's not enough to just understand how a country's culture might differ from your own, how a country's political environment might differ from your own, or how a country's economy might differ from your own. We can do more. We can measure them. We can measure those differences, and we can use those measures to express that risk in a financially and economically meaningful way. Now, I'd just like to leave you with one last thought. Because when I think about globalization, for you, this is football. For us in the United States, this is football. And obviously, these reflect or epitomize differences in the institutional history and development of the United States and Brazil. And I've spent the last 20 minutes or so talking to you about those differences. I just want to be clear. Yes, these differences create risks. Yes, these differences make it hard to communicate, to do business with, to transact across borders. But for me, these differences are things that should be celebrated. Because we can't allow these differences to create divides. Thank you very much for your time.